So we now turn to China, and actually we begin with a bit of review. We had talked a bit about the rise of the Qin dynasty. Before that, you had a period of political fragmentation, sometimes referred to as the late Zhou era. And I should, right at the beginning, apologize for what I'm sure will be very poor pronunciation in many cases of Chinese names and terms, but I will do my best. And so you had this period where China was politically fragmented. This was the period during which Confucius had actually operated, and in part was motivated by a desire to come up with a governmental system or a philosophy by which China might be united. As it turns out, China was eventually united by the Qin. This was in the 4th century BCE, beginning with the conquest of Sichuan. That became kind of a base of operations from which they were able to eventually conquer other parts of China. Part of their success, at least initially, was that they adopted from an early point the philosophy of legalism, which in some ways stemmed from Confucianism, but you might remember it was kind of based on the idea that human nature is inherently bad. A major proponent of that was Shunzi. And so, kind of the idea that in order to have a stable society, you really need to use the threat of punishment and promise of reward in order to get people to behave correctly. And so the Qin adopted that philosophy. After a period of political fragmentation, for a lot of people, who desired above and beyond anything else stability and order, they were prepared to live under the harsh rule of the Qin. For one thing, territory that they brought under their control, the stability there actually attracted other people to move there. So, this generated a lot of revenue. You had many farmers who were kind of settling in Qin-controlled territory. But they also had a very strong military, in part because they had been fighting nomadic raiders for a long period, so they were quite well prepared militarily, and in fact had adopted many tactics, nomadic tactics, as part of the cavalry. So they were very effective and were eventually able to unite China. This was under the ruler Sheng, who again was a strong advocate of legalism. And so his administration heavily advised by legalist followers of the legalist school of thought. And so, again, initially this was actually very attractive if you had just gone through decades or even centuries of instability and disorder. This was kind of your primary concern. And so between 232 and 221 BCE, he was able to bring most of China under Qin control and eventually adopted the title of emperor. Turns out the Qin Empire would actually be pretty short-lived, but it did, in a sense, kind of lay the foundation for future dynasties by uniting China. Coming back to Zheng, he took the title of Shi Huangdi, or First Emperor, and then continued to expand territory that was under his control, capturing the Red River Basin in the south. Um, and then, probably most famously, the Qin would actually start connecting different bits of defensive walls to create a single Great Wall. And this is something that would then continue to be developed for centuries after him. But in any event, this kind of marks the beginning of the Great Wall, and at this point, really quite large, actually, extending for about 1,400 miles from the Pacific Ocean to Central Asia. And here we see parts of the Great Wall today. You can see on the map roughly what it constituted at the time of the Qin dynasty. One thing I want to point out, right? I mean, walls like this, and we already talked about Hadrian's Wall with the Romans in Britain. Uh, Obviously they might at least slow down an invading force, but it wasn't kind of the idea that this wall is just going to keep people out. Among other things, right, you have these little fortresses at various points that would provide garrisons for soldiers. They also kind of function as lookout towers that you're able to see what's coming. It facilitates the movement of troops along the frontier and so forth. And here we can see kind of a more distant view of the Great Wall, so including larger parts of it. right? So it is quite long. By the way, contrary to popular belief, you cannot see it from space. It's certainly long enough that you might conceivably see it, but not nearly wide enough. So the Qin system, heavily based on legalism, one very important minister, Li Si, who really helped to develop an administration based on legalist philosophy. And the basic idea was that government officials should be chosen first and foremost on their ability. So, it shouldn't be depending on your social status, which is something that would be greatly resented by the aristocracy, who are kind of used to the idea that the simple fact of being an aristocrat should actually see you holding important positions in government. Bureaucracy, the administration was supposed to be impersonal. Law should apply equally to all. This is certainly, I think, for most people living today, living in the United States in particular, the kind of hard to find fault with that. But at the time, this did rub a lot of people the wrong way. Again, the aristocracy had tended to think that status should be a major consideration. Who you know should in some ways matter more than what you know in terms of your advancement. Aristocracy would still be pretty important at the more local level, but many of the more important members were forced to resettle in the capital. Kind of an idea of like, keep your friends close, keep your potential enemies closer. And so, the problem with this is, not that I'm a strong advocate of the aristocracy, but they might have been the wrong social group to tick off, right? I mean, you kind of wanted to have them be more supportive of what you were trying to implement. So that's going to create problems. And then added to that, I mean, the Qin were very rigid, right? So it was kind of, either you're 100% on board with legalism or you're the enemy, right? So, really kind of promoting the idea of a uniform bureaucracy where everyone was completely on board with legalism. This did have one advantage. They developed a kind of unified Chinese writing system. So, even if people spoke different dialects in different parts of China, you would be using the same writing system, and that would facilitate communication. But, really, you had to be on board with legalism. Books based on Confucianism or any other school were burned. In some cases, scholars were actually buried alive if they didn't support legalism. So obviously, you're alienating many people who perhaps it would have been more helpful to bring into the fold. By the way, we might mention just one tradition associated with the Qin. The idea of kind of when you buried an emperor, you would bury them with statues of soldiers, in a sense, kind of creating an army for them that they could take with them into the afterlife. So, they would be life size, so they would be made out of a material called terracotta. And just kind of a fun fact, particularly given the third Mummy movie, which perhaps some of you are fans of. Well, as I mentioned, the Qin dynasty proved short lived. Following the death of the first emperor in 210 BCE, a rebellion broke out. And, get this, the generals that were sent to put down the rebellion were basically told, if you fail, you will be punished by death. Which, I kind of understand why, if you're the emperor, you might feel strongly about, providing incentive for them to succeed. But this actually had perhaps the unintended consequence of persuading many generals they were better off joining the rebellion. Um, so, I guess at some point they decided that, uh, you know, they put their own kind of possibility of their own survival ahead of the interests of the Qin dynasty. So that pretty much was probably the decisive factor in bringing the Qin dynasty to an end. And by this time, the principle of the mandate of heaven, which we had discussed earlier, was pretty much in place as a kind of way of explaining why one dynasty might come to an end and eventually a new dynasty would rise, right? You have this kind of cycle of dynasties, very often a brief period of political fragmentation or internal warfare. But, then eventually a strong leader would emerge who would unify China. And the idea was that heaven, this kind of, not a place, right, but this kind of grander force that unified all elements of nature, would basically pass from one dynasty to another, right? The mandate would pass from one dynasty to another. And the idea that as long as you were looking out for the welfare of the people and so forth, that you were promoting good government, you would continue to have the mandate. But as soon as you stopped doing that, eventually you would lose the mandate, right? The right to govern might be the best way to put it, and it would eventually pass to someone else. Uh, and this is particularly illustrative of the fact that China would always eventually unify. So periodically, China would politically fragment. The ruling dynasty might lose power, be unable to maintain control. But eventually, someone else would emerge, right? And this is maybe one of the main differences between, say, China and developments in Europe. When the Roman Empire finally fell apart, Europe would never really become unified after that, right? There'd be a number of different attempts. We'll be looking at some of those later. You could argue that the European Union is, in fact, the most recent attempt at unifying Europe. But this is a major difference, right? China inevitably always becomes unified. And until today, China has a very strong sense of itself as a kind of unified entity, right? Chinese people, that they belong to a very large state, inclusive of many people. Well, the dynasty that does eventually emerge is the Han dynasty, and in some ways, perhaps the most important dynasty in Chinese history. In some ways, what would be today recognized as Chinese civilization culture really taking its proper form under the Han. And in fact, the term Han very often today understood as referring to a kind of ethnicity, people who are like purely Chinese in an ethnic sense, but originally the term referring to a ruling dynasty, a ruling family. And it begins with the rebel general Gao Zu, who gained control of a part of China, the Wei Basin, around between 206 195 BCE, and from there would go on to unify China. And one thing he decided from an early point is that inasmuch as Qin policies had actually started to turn people against the Qin, he would actively avoid them. So some of these policies, for instance, had involved heavy taxation, right? So he's going to reduce taxes. Certain Qin policies tended to emphasize punishment, right? That, again, with legalism, keeping people in line involved the threat of punishment. So punishments will be made less severe. And in fact, Han rulers often, when later historians look back at them, they often see them as extremely wise rulers, right? People who really looked out for the welfare of their people. So often presented as kind of the model of a sage or wise emperor. And to be sure, China will really begin to prosper under them, right? I mean, they're very famous for their good government, particularly early on. The economy very quickly rebounding. One measure of that is that granaries are filled. One responsibility of the government is to make sure that there is a food supply in the event of poor harvest or famine. And related to this, as the economy prospers, revenue goes up, so the government becomes very wealthy. One of the greatest Han rulers, particularly if we're focusing on the early period, was a fellow named Wudi, often referred to as the Martial Emperor, who ruled from 141 to 87 BCE. So he's considered great, partly for expanding the territory under Han rule, expanding China into northern Vietnam, across Manchuria, and even as far as northern Korea, but also for economically developing the Han territory. So, for instance, he built a very important canal linking the Yellow River to the capital, so that kind of brought together two of the main economic regions. And he's really famous for maintaining what were known as ever-level granaries, right? So whatever surplus from crops, when you had a really good year, what they call bumper crops, would be bought up by the government and then stored for times of scarcity when it might be resold. It's kind of the idea that the granary should always be kept full. Having said that, some historians would say that there were definitely negative aspects to his rule. I mean, he did many, many positive things. But some of the things he did even reminded some of the hated Qin policies, the dynasty preceding the Han. So, for instance, to increase revenues, he levied heavy taxes on merchants, would sometimes debase the currency. Again, this is where you kind of use less precious metal in the currency. Is kind of the modern day equivalent would be printing money, and even selling some political offices, which based on Confucian philosophy, that should not be the reason someone attains governmental office. And at some point, he even sought to establish government monopolies on things like copper, salt, iron, and liquor. I mean, these are kind of commodities that are sold in large quantities, and so this is something that really would have upset certain merchants, right? That in order to have the right to engage in commerce related to these items, you would have had to pay the government something. And this actually led to one of the most important debates in the history of China, certainly in the history of the Han Dynasty, what's often referred to as the salt and iron debate. And it's kind of debate actually that would have worked very well within American politics about the appropriate role of government with respect to the economy. How involved should the government be? So on the one side, you had what we might call quasi-legalist officials. So I mean, they weren't proper legalists. That was no longer kind of a philosophy of government, but their view kind of reflected what one might have found in legalism, the idea that the state actually had the right to get involved in the economy. It should have the right to enjoy the profits from selling salt and iron, whether through taxation or the establishment of monopolies. On the other side of the debate were the Confucians, who argued that really government should not get too involved in economic activity. First of all, that the economy would do much better, so ultimately the government would derive more revenue, but also that it could be a very corrupting thing, right? That if government officials are dealing frequently with merchants, then they're going to be more concerned with acquiring wealth and promoting their own individual situation, right? So it's a kind of corrupting thing. And according to the historical account of this debate, the Confucians were considered to be the winners. Having said that, if we consider actual practice during the Han period, for instance, state monopolies would become a regular practice. So you could really kind of make the case that to some degree, in terms of how people actually behaved, how government operated, that legalism still prevailed. So this kind of theory versus practice. Now, in terms of defending the border, the primary threat were nomadic people to the north during the Han period, the Xiongnu in particular, who occasionally would form tribal alliances, kind of confederations, and that's when they would really prove a threat, right? When they came together, and so kind of the Han basically had two different approaches, you might call Plan A and Plan B, for how to deal with them. The first was to actually try and make alliances with neighboring tribes, thus preventing them from aligning with other tribes, and in fact even encouraging them to fight the more distant tribes, right? So that kind of would hopefully prevent them from actually uniting against the Han. Plan B, whenever possible, would be to colonize adjacent territories, territories adjacent to Han territory, where they would send large numbers of Han Chinese to colonize. And this particularly was the policy moving west into what presently constitutes Central Asia. Among other things, this would help to maintain control of the Silk Road. And by the way, I mean, this is a policy that you could argue is continued until now. So, territories in the western part of China where the majority of the population are not ethnically Chinese in the sense that today we would call Han Chinese. So very often Han Chinese are encouraged to go live there and to settle there with the idea that at some point they might even outnumber or at least be sizable enough a part of the population that it also sees a diffusion of Chinese culture and so forth and tying it to the center. Now, as we talked about throughout Chinese history, Chinese governments always had huge bureaucracies, right? And this is something, excuse me, in most parts of the world we tend to associate with kind of modern states. As we're going to find out in medieval Europe, for instance, you had almost no bureaucracy in many cases, and that would have greatly limited the actual real authority of the central government, or in the case of medieval Europe, a king. Chinese, going back from the beginning of Chinese civilization, bureaucracies were a major part of government. The Han bureaucracy numbered more than 130,000 officials by the 1st century BCE, and it was very hierarchical. I mean, they had different ranks. Officials were organized by grades. And payment was usually in grain, sometimes with cash or silk, but the primary form of payment, or the method by which they were paid, was grain. And it was kind of, it's funny, it was supposed to be strictly a meritocracy. In other words, those who were very often who were educated in Confucianism as kind of a basis for how to government, and then showed great promise, should have been advanced. But very often there was a bit of a kind of nepotism here, right, where it's more about who you know. And so, for instance, provincial officials were very responsible for recommending candidates who might enter the system, might eventually become bureaucrats. And of course, they would have picked people they felt were going to look out for the interests of their particular province or region. Education was a big part of the process, though, and particularly at the highest level. You would have had to have gone through the school established in Chang'an, which at some point would have 30,000 students by the later Han period. And Confucianism really was the name of the game, right? The legalist structure of government was pretty much based on Confucianism. The mandate of heaven, for instance, as a concept justifying dynastic rule, was a part of Confucianism. But Confucianism really lent itself to government, right? I mean, it kind of encouraged a very strong feeling of respect, certainly within the hierarchy, that people should respect their superiors and so forth, but also kind of respect for the whole process, for the keeping of records, very much about kind of the written word, in a sense of, the handing down of learning, looking to the past for examples about how to deal with present-day problems, and so forth. At the core, though, was the idea that men in government should be ethical. They should be moral men, right? And Confucius taught really about, if you think about it, in a sense, he was providing a guide for the transformation of oneself by cultivating ethical behavior. Maybe a more simple way of expressing that is kind of the idea of, if you practice being good, it becomes innate, it becomes natural to your being, right? And so the idea that, but ultimately it's not really just about the well-being of individuals, it's really about the kind of society you're creating, and in this case, the kind of government that you end up with, that it should be run by virtuous and talented men, right? A high respect for people who show capability, who are highly educated, and so forth. And then the idea, that if you have ethical men, laws would be interpreted in a just way, right? But the basis of, how do you cultivate this moral behavior was Confucianism. You have to have a Confucian education. Now again, in large measure, it is also about respecting hierarchy, respecting those who are above you, and then also those above you should behave in a just and fair manner towards you. Though, by the way, right, the fact that you should show respect for your betters did not depend on how they treated you. At the very top, of course, would have been the emperor, who was the all-powerful son of heaven and had absolute power. Having said that, occasionally you had weak or non-charismatic emperors. They might be weak also because they were a child when they took the throne. And in these instances, as would happen pretty much anywhere at any time in history, his authority might be challenged. In that case, you might find that people lower down in the hierarchy might rule in his name. So for instance, you really can, as far as who are the most important groups that might actually exercise some measure of authority, those would be at the top, court officials, the Empress Dowager, who would have been the favored wife and very often the mother of the heir, later on maybe even the mother of the actual emperor. Court eunuchs, simply because they had access to the emperor, and military commanders. Now, as I mentioned, most important after the emperor were the court officials. These were the most powerful individuals beneath him. The thing was, this is very much, though, a high-risk, high-reward kind of thing, right? I mean, if you're going to be a court official at the very top level, and, so long as you enjoy the favor of the emperor, it definitely is a pretty good deal. On the other hand, if things go wrong, you might end up taking the blame, and you could end up in exile, you might be imprisoned, or you might be even killed. Consider that Emperor Wudi alone had 5 prime ministers executed. The Empress Dowager was the wife whose child was heir to the throne, and particularly if her husband died while the heir was still very young, she might act as a regent, someone in a sense governing on his behalf until he came of age. And in a few cases, probably most famously with Empress Lu, they might actually cling on to power. So for instance, Empress Lu very famously murdered a rival and then even murdered her own son when he came of age so that she could stay in power. I mean, she then made her younger son the new heir. And this is around 241 to 180 BCE. Next, we have the court eunuchs, who came mostly from families of low status. And of course, hopefully we don't need to explain in great detail what a eunuch is. These are individuals who were castrated as boys and assigned to the emperor's harem. A harem in this sense really just strictly referring to his private chambers. But by virtue of that, they would have had a very kind of intimate personal relationship with the emperor, and therefore very often could exercise tremendous influence. You could argue they were kind of a counterweight to officials, and there are a lot of stories about them getting involved in various kinds of courtroom intrigues. And then finally, you have the military commanders. And these, in some ways, were the people that the emperor and very often court officials feared the most, simply because they would have armies under their commands. So very often you would have regional military commanders that, when they were far from the capital, they were almost as if they were semi-independent rulers. And given that they had armies that very often were loyal to them first and foremost, there was always a possibility they might try to take over the throne. For this reason, to try and prevent them from becoming too powerful, appointments were only given for specific campaigns of limited duration, and then usually in pairs, with the idea that each military commander would check the other. And a lot of this was kind of orchestrated by the court officials, who were trying to prevent generals from establishing bases of personal power elsewhere that they might then later use to challenge the central government. And we might finish this part of the lecture by considering exactly what it is the imperial government did. So it does have a huge bureaucracy, which means that it can actually involve itself in different levels of government. Its primary responsibilities, of course, and this is typical of most governments even until today, first and foremost the collecting of taxes. Particularly if you have this big a bureaucracy, you have a lot of officials that have to be paid. The maintaining of military forces, primarily for defense of the realm, but also for maintaining security within. The administering of justice, i.e. laws, maintaining the imperial palace, which in a sense very important as a kind of propaganda, right? That it should be something very awe-inspiring, right? If you're going to go visit the emperor, there should be a feeling that you're approaching someone of great power. And then, the carrying out of basic public works in the sense of kind of maintaining important canals and roads and so forth. Maybe construction in some of the major cities, certainly in Chang'an, the capital. Below that, government very often in the hands of local notables and large landowners. And to some degree, as long as they weren't making trouble for the imperial government, they had a great deal of freedom in how they managed local affairs. So we're going to stop here with part 1 of the lecture. So do make sure to, when you're done with this, to look at part 2.